All right, welcome back, and we're here with Joey Katzen. Joey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Joey's a volunteer lead mentor for Blue Startups, also a Hawaii licensed attorney and board member of Hawaii Angels, which is an investment group. And Joey, I want to start off with your thoughts on the affordable housing situation. What is your long-term vision for affordable housing in Hawaii?
Right. I'd like to say that my background was not directly in housing, though I was a land use attorney for a year back in the mainland years ago. It's more that I've been very successful in my career, and I feel like now it's time for me to put some of my attention and resources towards other things that are near and dear to my heart. And one of them is affordable housing in the communities around me. I It really comes down to like a core principle that I think that more people should be able to live affordably in more of our neighborhoods in Hawaii, and specifically on Oahu, because I don't know the details on the ground as much on the other islands. This seems like an obvious thing that more people should be able to live affordably in more of our neighborhoods. But the reality is that we have created a bunch of laws over the last 40 years that have taken 98% of the buildable land in the state and set it aside and said, you can't have anything more than one single house on this property. So we've gotten to the point now where, especially in Oahu, we've run out of fresh green land that we've decided as a society that we're willing to build on. The Eva Plain was sort of the end of it. There's a little bit of land left out there, but we're now at the point where we need more housing for a variety of reasons: population growth, changes in multi-generational housing in Hawaii, which broke down on the mainland 100 years ago, but is just happening here now. But there's a tremendous demand and need for more housing, and we've made it impossible to build virtually everywhere. We've taken 2% of our land along these major corridors in the city and said, we'll allow developers that have a huge risk appetite to build 40-story buildings. But if we want to put any more housing in Kahala or in Kaimuki or in any of the ridges out to Hawaii Kai or anywhere else, that's just impossible to do.
Yeah, and you talked about just one plot of land being used for one house. That goes back to the idea of like suburban sprawl, and we see that in Oahu specifically a lot too, where there's one big house on a big plot of land, and that goes back to kind of like the zoning laws that you were bringing up. So, how do we combat with those single lot homes?
Yeah, and what I'm going to talk about may seem revolutionary to people that have grown up in the last 50 years, but it shouldn't be, and it's crazy. Um, so if you look at the statistics, there were about twice as many housing units built on Oahu in the 30 years leading up to 1990, so 1960 to 1990, as there were in the 30 years from 1990 to 2020. Twice as many units were built in the prior 30 years. And that's because through a series of general plan updates, 1979, 1982, there's a bunch of them. The city and county of Honolulu changed its zoning law. And not your readers, your listeners may not all know about what zoning law is, but it's basically government regulations that say what you can build on any particular piece of land. Historically, the way the communities have developed since the dawn of civilization is you start with an open field and you build cabins, and then over time those cabins turn into homes, and then as the population grows and it becomes and the population spreads out and starts to fill up the land, it gets to the point where there's so many people and it's too spread out. There tend to be a series of redevelopment activity that happens. So individual houses, they start being torn down or subdivided into duplexes, or they build what we call in Hawaii ohana homes, which is the one sort of like release valve for this in Hawaii that a lot of states don't have. And Stanley Chang, the senator, talks a lot about that. It's a great release valve we have. But if you look at other cities, again, so single family houses start everywhere, then they get split into duplexes. And then 50 years go by and those duplexes come down and they build 6-unit buildings, like 3-story walk-ups, is which there are a ton on Oahu. And then over time, more and more gets redeveloped, denser and denser. And that's what happens when you run out of land. On the mainland, you can keep driving and building forever to some extent. I mean, what's apparent on Oahu is you just can't keep going. At some point, you just run out of land. And it's time that we have a need for more housing. The only way to resolve it is to allow more housing in the communities that are already built in. But what happened in the zoning law, zoning is something that is only about 120 years old. So until about the early part of the 20th century, at least in the United States and in a lot of other countries, if you owned a piece of land, you could build whatever you wanted on the piece of land. You wanted to build a market there, you build a market. You wanted to build a 5-story building, you build a 5-story building. No one could argue against you. There might have been some building codes, but basically you could build whatever you wanted. And then if there was a big problem that came in, a pig farm opened up next door, then the neighbors could sue over that, something called nuisance law that could conceivably get that nuisance to go away. What happened with zoning law, the Supreme Court allowed it in the early part of the 20th century. Again, I'm an attorney, I've studied this stuff. The Supreme Court basically legalized something called zoning law, which says that the government in advance, even before there's a nuisance, can decide what it wants to have on each piece of property. So this land over here can be a market. This land over here can be a single family home. We'll allow an apartments on these tiny little pieces of land. A bad effect of that in the US is we've separated everything. So no matter where you live, you pretty much have to drive everywhere. You can't walk anywhere. And that's all because of zoning law. But as it relates more to housing, the zoning laws came into effect and they got stronger and stronger and stronger. And around 1980 on Oahu, they got ratcheted down really tightly. You'll notice that around the island, there's a lot of places that have these sort of random 40-story high-rises in strange places. It seems strange. Ka'ava, I think, has one. There's some in Pearl Highlands. There are a few of them all over the place. And that's because they were all built before the zoning law changed around 1980. It used to be, it was easier to build that. Now, I'm not advocating and saying we need to have high-rises everywhere. I don't think that's the easiest way to solve this
Right.
problem. But what's happened is we went from a world where you could build whatever you wanted anywhere to a world now where you can barely build anything anywhere. And it's no wonder that nothing gets built. Historically, most of the homes that were built from 1960 to 1990 on Oahu, most of the units were actually in concrete 3-story walk-up buildings with no elevators. And most of them were built by mom and pop developers. They were small guys, small families that saw a piece of land and were willing to take the risk, to risk their entire life savings on building a piece of land that may have been in their family or maybe they bought it. And they were able to get a permit in 2 or 3 weeks to build something on it and to take that risk. They'd build that apartment, and then within 12 months, they could rent those units out or sell them. Eventually, you could sell them as condos. They couldn't. There was no condo law back then. What happened was we made it so hard to build there, either because we explicitly banned it in the zoning code, which is the biggest thing, and secondly, because we've started requiring permits for so many things that we didn't used to require permits for. And we've all burdened this understaffed permit office, downtown to look at all these permits. And instead of taking 2 weeks to get a building permit as it takes in Texas, or 2 months as it takes in Virginia, in Oahu, it routinely takes 2 years to get a building permit. If you have a house and your roof is leaking, it can take you 2 years to get a fix for that. And it's crazy. And the effect of that is small-time entrepreneur developers, families that might want to build duplexes or small rows of townhouses or small apartment buildings, even if it were allowed by zoning, just can't take that risk because they can't run the risk that they're going to spend all this money, spend $1 million trying to get the permits, because that's sometimes what it costs with the legal work, just to get rejected or just for it to take too long and not be able to do it. So what happens is the only housing that gets developed is by really deep-pocketed, almost corporate developers. Now, they could be homegrown developers, but they're companies that have made a huge business out of building high-rises. And because it's so expensive to do it, the only way they can make any of their money back and actually, economically build these buildings is to build high-rises. And in particular, to build high-rises specifically for the wealthy. Because if it's going to take you 4 or 5 years to get the zoning changed and get all the permits and pardon my language, but kiss everyone's ass, all the neighbors, to be able to get a project built that everyone kind of agrees should be built because it's around a lot of other tall buildings. And if you have a choice of being able to build that building and sell luxury units or sell affordable middle class housing units, you're obviously going to build luxury units because it's the only way to make your money back, and it takes you the same amount of time either way. If we relaxed this and made it easier to build things out of, because we made the zoning easier to get, we didn't make everything sort of conditional. We didn't make it so you had to get city council's permission and every neighbor's permission every time, but we set clear rules for what we're willing to do. We would create what's called as by right housing, by right zoning, which means that we've created rules where we allow someone to build it just by the right. You buy the property, you can basically build it. You might have to get some permits, but you can build it. And single family homes are all by right. But what isn't by right is a duplex. What isn't by right is a row of townhouses. What isn't by right is a small apartment building. So the only affordable thing that you can actually build without getting lots and lots and lots of permission is single family homes, and yet single family detached homes. And yet we're out of land. So where is it going to go? And it creates really perverse things. Like if you look at Kahala, there are some parcels in Kahala that are limited by zoning to being one house on 10,000 square feet. It's about a quarter of an acre of land. Now that house could be 4,000 square feet, 5,000 square feet, 6,000 square feet. It could be a mansion. But what's not allowed in that is 6 1,000 square foot townhomes. So the government, and we as a society have enabled this, is we've created an environment where one very, very, very wealthy person is allowed to live on an oceanfront lot in Kahala with the great schools on beautiful land and build a 6,000 square foot house. But we're not allowed to build on that land. Even if we bought it, if I bought the land today, I'm not allowed to subdivide that into 6 homes or to knock it down and build 6 townhomes on that land. We specifically, with government power, given a monopoly to our richest neighbors and said, we're not going to allow anyone else to live in this neighborhood because we've decided that you as a homeowner, it's more important that you not have traffic or not have more than one family living next to you or not have to walk more than 10 feet to your car. We've decided we're going to give you that veto and give you guys a monopoly over dozens or hundreds or thousands of other families in different neighborhoods being able to have a roof over their head. And it's crazy. And it doesn't have to be this way.
It's definitely a weird situation. I mean, people have to make returns on their investments, like you said, and there really is no way with like exportation costs, everything like that, infrastructure to be able to get a return on buying land unless, like you said, unless you do target the audience that they are. And that goes back to the question of like infrastructure. What specifically in the building permits, which have been so limited recently and how much have been handed out, what part does infrastructure lie in? What specific laws limit infrastructure relative to building homes?
So I don't want to overplay the permit situation as it relates to infrastructure, because there are certain parts of the island that have limited sewer capacity and things like that. There definitely are. They're not as much in town, but there are some places. So there are some areas where if the government wants to spend some money, wants to throw some money at that, they could increase sewer capacity in different areas. It's more the structure of the permits, how many you have to get, and how many of them give the permit department discretion. So they can't just say, yes, this checks a bunch of boxes, but instead the permit department gets a lot of choice in the matter of how to interpret different things. And I'm not saying that each one of the permits doesn't have a justifiable reason, whether it's ecological resources or water resources, or whether it's archaeological resources. And there's a lot of different reasons. Architectural review permits, there's a bunch of them, but there's too many of them, and they required a lot of them to be done in series as opposed to in parallel. And we don't have enough staff to be able to do them. I wanted to talk about one other thing, which is a
Sure.
relief valve. And we've created a little bit of a relief valve in that there have been a handful of laws passed that make it easier to build housing. One of them was Bill 7, which allows kind of micro unit walk-up affordable housing. There's some different state bills that have enabled some of the high-rise construction that have affordable lotteries out there to be able to sort of sell units to people that need affordable housing and to go into the lottery. The quirk of a lot of these laws, not Bill 7, but a lot of the other ones, and it actually includes the new government emergency proclamation that the governor has
Okay.
signed is they create a release valve that allows you to bypass a lot of the permits, bypass a lot of the parking requirements, bypass a lot of the zoning to build stuff. But they require, in exchange for that, that you use a certain type of government set pricing for everyone that sets foot on the land to build the property. It's called uh, not the going rate. I forget what the term of it is. There's a term for it, but it's effectively union wages in which are set by the federal government with some help from the states. Prevailing wages is what it's called. So there's a prevailing wage law. So we've said as a government society, we're going to have bids on government projects. If the government accepts a bid, the government has to be willing to pay a certain price. That only applies to government works usually. On Oahu, the prevailing labor price, the government set price, is about 2.5 times the market rate price. So if you want to go have someone work on your roof on your house in Kalihi, you pay one price. If you are a developer trying to put a roof on a house as part of a project that's had relaxed zoning, made it easier to bypass some of these permissive affordable housing, you have to pay 2.5 times the price. And that's the relief valve. And that's because there's a lot of value to unions. I'm not condemning unions, but what we have done here is we have price set housing and said, and we're holding affordable housing hostage on top of the zoning and on top of the permit rules. We are holding housing hostage by price flooring all the laborers, all the labor that goes into it. To show something about this that's crazy is it would be as if we said vaping is bad for society. So we're going to allow vape shops. But every employee who works in a vape shop, if you want to be open as a vape shop, instead of paying them minimum wage or the going rate these days, $20 an hour, instead of paying the going rate for a cashier in your vape shop, if you want to open a vape shop, you have to use this government set price for labor, which isn't $20 an hour, it's $50 an hour. Because we've just decided that for vape shops, you have to pay 2.5 times the going rate. The effect of that would be either that we have way fewer vape shops, or the price of vaping on island would go way up because you have to pay all these cashiers. Everyone who paints the vape shop would have to be paid 2.5 times the rate. The quirk of it is vaping is not good for us. Vaping is something we should want less of. There's a reason to do it, but we haven't done this with vaping. No, we have decided there's a single industry, a single type of good in this state that we've decided we want to charge 2.5. We want to force the private sector negotiating with their laborers. We want to force them to have to pay 2.5 times the price of what the laborers, the roofers, the painters would be willing to do it for, and what they do it for all the rest of us. We've decided there's one industry where we're going to force it to be 2.5 times the price, and that is housing. So right when we need affordable housing, we have held affordable housing hostage on these three things. And I firmly believe that if we relax these three things, we would have mom and pop, small family developers coming out of the woodworks, building townhouses in Kahala, building more small apartment buildings, which have barely been built in McCully in the last 40 years, that we would be seeing townhouses all over the island in neighborhoods with good schools that we need. But it's just impossible right now.
It's definitely a loophole and just backed by those laws, like you said, and there's a lot of issues that go into it too, including one that you did touch up on a little bit, which was accessibility. And I mean, I think it's a pretty general consensus that neighborhoods should be easily accessible, but there are a lot that have accessibility issues. How do we combat that, and what are the issues when it comes to accessibility?
When you say accessibility, do you mean getting around, like transportation?
Yeah, transportation, that whole kind of thing too,
Yeah.
because it's primarily cars and everything is far away.
Yeah, that's the third rail, isn't it? That's you talk to all the people after community meetings to discuss new housing that might be built in their neighborhood. The thing, there's all kinds of reasons why people might say they don't want the housing, they don't like the color of the building, or they, who knows, it could be noise. What it seems to come down to in Oahu and on a lot of places on the mainland too is parking. People are scared that there's gonna be too many people in their neighborhood, and there's parking is going to be a little harder to find. And there is some truth to that. And we have to be those of us that are advocates for more affordable housing in our neighborhoods have to be empathetic to that, because the truth is people have chosen their neighborhoods and chosen to live where they lived. They didn't set the zoning rules, right? And they barely even know they exist. They've chosen
Mhm.
to live there based on the amount of traffic they have then and the fact that parking is close to them. If you have a, I'm having a baby in a few days, my wife is, and being able to park close by and be able to fit a stroller into the car, that's all valuable. We have to decide as a society what is that line and what's going to give, because at this point there's we have to have more housing, and we have to have some sort of release valve for that housing, and what might get sacrificed is parking. It doesn't mean that we need to have skyscrapers in Kahala with no parking garages that take up all the parking on the street, but there's plenty of parking on the street in Kahala right now. Like, there's a lot of neighborhoods that are not problematic for parking, and we could fit twice as many people in those neighborhoods without really anyone else noticing. In the neighborhoods where parking is tight, it's tough. Eventually the answer would be, let's build a better transit system in the long run, and let's allow more corner stores and and dry cleaners and whatnot in the neighborhood, so that people don't have to get in a car for every last activity. But that's going to take generations and generations to fix. And in the meantime, we do have the fact that people are going to drive everywhere in those neighborhoods, and it's hard. There are policy ways you can resolve it. You can one of the things that's been tried in a lot of cities, like Arlington, Virginia, has been using it for 30 years, residential parking permits. You give everyone in the neighborhood one permit for free, maybe, and then per unit that's in there, and then beyond that one parking space per unit, you make them buy the rest, and maybe it's $1,000 a year, maybe it's $2,000 a year, but so that everyone has to internalize the cost of their parking. And eventually that's something that becomes aware, and if people can't afford that, they won't move into the neighborhood. The quirk of it is that not everyone needs as many cars as they have, and the second you put a price on it sometimes works itself out. There's a lot of couples on this island that only need one car for both people. Now maybe they could have two, and if they have a free parking space, they might have two cars, but they may not need it. There's university students that don't need parking. There's plenty of people that do need parking, but there's no reason the government should be requiring parking if people are willing. A student is forced to pay an extra $500 a month because it's built into his rent to get an apartment near
Yeah.
UH. He doesn't have a car. Why are we forcing him to pay $500 more a month?
And let's segue into like the last question here. Are there any specific places that are doing affordable housing right? Any solutions that a certain country is doing that you like and you want to model off of, even though Hawaii is technically unique and different from all areas, especially because we're isolated?
Yeah. Hawaii is so different in so many ways, right? And I'm very respectful of that. I've been here 12 years. It's obviously that the history is consequential here, and there's a lot of sensitivities around that. It's also just because it's an island. It's like there's some geographic constraints and whatnot. But I mean, Hong Kong's also an island, and it has skyscrapers everywhere, which is not what I'm advocating for here. But I don't think we even have to look to other countries. We can talk about one in a second, New Zealand, which is an interesting case. But even in the U.S., there's a number of cities and states that are rolling back detached single family zoning caps statewide. Typically what happens is the closer you are down to the issue, the more forcefully someone believes about it. So if I live on a street and my neighbor is trying to build a duplex, it might upset me. Beyond just me, the whole street might be may not be as upset as I am, but the street is upset, and then the neighborhood, it filters its way up to the city or state. The effect of this is that the closer you are down to the bottom of the problem, the more incentive there is for politicians to keep these rules very restrictive. Because if they change them, they can get voted out of the office by the people, the small groups of people that elect them. But this is a society-wide problem where we need housing, and it's small individual cases where people are blocking housing for everyone because everyone in their own street doesn't want it on their street, right? So
Sure.
a number of states have done. Minnesota, Oregon has done it. Washington's starting to dig into it. They're basically abolishing the right of cities and counties to ban multifamily housing, or they put restrictions on it. Say, California is also experimenting with this, where we're saying at a state level, we are going to allow duplexes or triplexes or quadplexes, 4 unit apartments or townhouses on every parcel that was otherwise single family house. And we're not going to allow individual cities and counties to block that. And that is starting to take effect in a bunch of places in the US. Now, it's going to take a while for this to actually produce a lot of housing. We've got 30, 40, 50 years of a housing shortage right now. It's going to take a while for mom and pop developers to come back up and pick up the slack, which is why there's a lot of room for government subsidized housing, big corporate developers building subsidized housing and whatnot. But it's starting to work in those areas. New Zealand is an interesting case study I mentioned because they decided to do this countrywide, and they legalized triplexes and quadplexes virtually everywhere in the country. And they did that about 5 years ago. And if you look at New Zealand versus Australia versus other countries in the area and where their housing production has gone and where their affordability is, New Zealand housing prices have gone up like just barely. But Australia's, the US's, Western Europe's have gone crazy like that. And it totally coincides with when they enabled this law. This is kind of basic stuff. This is how we've been building communities for thousands and thousands of years. And it's no wonder that right when we tighten up all our regulations and all our permit rules and everything and make it so hard to build, right when we're running out of free green land to build on, it's no wonder that this is a crisis right now.
And that was very insightful. Thank you so much, Joey. And I think that's all we have for today. Once again, Joey Katzen, thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for reaching out. Well,